Hey all, today I'm going to be telling you about the differences between houses and flats. I'll be telling you about the differences in ownership, the differences in upkeep, comparing their overall values, the refurbishment potential of both, and, if you stay to the end of the video, which one is a better investment. But before we get started, make sure to drop a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now let's get into the video. Firstly, let's talk about the differences in ownership. When you purchase a flat, you typically purchase it under a leasehold agreement, which means that you're only renting the ground that the house has been built on. This is obviously a longer term form of renting, like more than 10 years, more than 50 years, maybe even more than 100 years, and is obviously therefore not a short term form of renting, like say less than 2 years or a 12-month agreement, for example. A new leasehold property will typically come with a lease of 125 years, and it counts down from there. For example, if you bought a property in the 70s, you've probably got say 70 or 80 years remaining on your lease. And a bank typically won't finance a property that has less than 60 years remaining on the lease. Therefore, it's probably wise to extend your lease as it gets lower. But obviously, if there's less than 80 years remaining on your lease, it can be a lot more expensive to extend, typically upwards of £20,000. The advantage of extending a lease is that you're usually granted a term of say 999 years, so obviously it will basically never expire. There are some lenders that will finance a property with less than 60 years remaining on the lease, but it might be a little bit more expensive, as in the lender might charge a higher interest rate, or more expensive upfront fees, and also it will be really expensive obviously to extend the lease as well. So you've got to kind of weigh it up. You might be looking at a property and thinking it's going for a really good price, but actually it's because it's got a really small lease and therefore it costs a lot to extend it. A house, on the other hand, is typically purchased on a freehold agreement, which means that you obviously own the land that the house is built on as well as the house, and therefore there's no lease term that never expires. So obviously that can be a bit of an advantage. I would say that a leasehold property is typically less desirable because there is always that fear around the leasehold term. And obviously if that term does ever expire, then the person that owns the land gets to keep the property that's built on it as well. So even if you did pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for the flat, but your lease term expired, the person that owns the land would actually just get to take it from you for free. And the same thing happens if you can't pay the rental to the person that actually owns the land. If you default on your ground rent agreement, then the person that owns the land can again take the property from you. Fortunately, you probably shouldn't default on your ground rent because it is very, very cheap, like £100 a year or £60 a year, for example. Let's talk about the differences in upkeep as well. And the first one with leasehold properties is ground rent. Because you're obviously purchasing the property on a leasehold agreement, you have to pay an annual rental to the person that actually owns the land that the property is built on, which is the ground rent. It's usually really cheap, like 60 to 100, maybe a little bit more each year. The land will originally be owned by the house builder, so Persimmons Homes or Barratt Developments or Crest Nicholson, the list goes on. But these house builders do sometimes sell the rights to the land, and therefore the rights to the land that the property is built on, to management companies. These management companies are actually really interesting, and believe it or not, it's a whole different way to invest in property, because you can go and buy these little plots of land and the right to receive the rental income from the tenants. And obviously because these plots of land are quite cheap, because you only receive a fairly small amount, you can obviously buy quite a few of them. And it's almost like a guaranteed rental, because no one's going to fail to pay the £100 a year and risk losing their £250,000 flat. These agreements typically also have a fixed increase factored into them every 5 or 10 years, although this has caused some problems recently. In 2016-2017 there was a scandal going around where some of the properties built in 2011-2012 by some of the big house builders were sold with what were called 10-year doubler leases, and therefore obviously the price and the ground rental on those doubled every 10 years. Now this doesn't really seem too bad, because obviously if something's only doubling every 10 years, it's not really increasing that much. But if something doubles and then doubles again and again 5 separate times, that's the equivalent of something increasing by 32 times. Therefore, instead of paying £1,000 a month for your mortgage, you'll be paying £32,000 every month for that mortgage, which is just crazy. If you've enjoyed the video so far, then leave a comment down below, let me know whether you prefer houses or flats. Also, leave a comment down below, let me know what kind of videos you want to see in the future. And next up with leasehold properties is service charge. The management company obviously owns all the communal areas of the property, like the hallways, the joining walls, the roof, maybe the very front door that obviously leads into the block of flats. And therefore you'll have to pay a monthly charge to obviously go towards the upkeep of all these communal areas. Again, it's typically not that much, maybe like £100 a month, so £1,000, £1,500 a year. Alternatively, if you didn't want to pay the service charge, or maybe the management company were just really hard to get hold of, or maybe they were just pretty rubbish, or maybe the house builder still owns the rights to the land and they're equally as bad to get hold of, then all the leaseholders of all the properties could club together and buy the freehold and start their own little management company, and then you'll be contributing to a sinking fund. You might not have to pay into this sinking fund monthly, you might only need to pay into it when the repairs are needed, and I guess all of the tenants would individually pay their own share into that sinking fund to pay for the repairs split evenly between them all. In comparison, typically with houses, because obviously you own the land that the house is built on, you therefore don't have to pay ground rent to a management company, and you don't have to pay service charge or contribute to a sinking fund. But you do have to pay for all of the repairs yourself. Even if there's a problem with the roof or the foundations, you obviously need to pay for it. And obviously if you then have a terraced house and you actually share a wall with someone else, you might have to go halves to repair that wall or kind of figure out an agreement. So a service charge could be a good thing because it's already preset that you're going to be splitting the repairs equally between everyone. And you can obviously just contribute small amounts to the service charge each month instead of having to pay a big huge amount all at once for a big repair. But it could also be a bit of an issue because you might end up paying more in that service charge than you would in the repairs, because obviously if nothing breaks you don't have to pay for anything, whereas with a service charge you'd still have to pay that monthly amount each month. In terms of overall values, flats are typically less appealing because obviously you have to share the space with other people. Especially at the moment during the current crisis, that's not really a great thing. But also because you're having to share a wall or a ceiling or a floor with other people, you might not necessarily get along. Obviously if you have different schedules, for example you work during the day but they work during the night, or you like to watch TV when they're trying to sleep, you might not necessarily get along because it might obviously distract or disturb the other people. Flats are typically also smaller, and obviously larger properties tend to sell for more because obviously there's more space for a family and just more space to enjoy. Maybe there's an additional bedroom or just an extra lounge or just general more square footage. Obviously this isn't always the case because a flat in Park Lane, for example, will definitely sell for more than a house in Scotland. But obviously if you were comparing like for like in the exact same area, a house, and especially a detached house, will pretty much always sell for more than a flat. Safety can also be quite a big consideration as well, and both flats and houses each have their own ups and downs. Flats obviously have the downside of being next to a lot of other little flats as well, and therefore you've got a lot of people in a close vicinity that might not necessarily get along. But flats do sometimes have the advantage of coming with a concierge or a security service or even a private security guard. And if you own a house, you probably don't have a private security guard. But houses are less densely populated and typically aren't right in the middle of a city centre, and therefore you've probably got less people that walk near or right past your house. Because houses are typically further away from other neighbours, and you also typically don't have to share a ceiling or a floor with someone else, they tend to be more expensive than flats. However, because of this, you're probably also paying more per square metre when you buy a house compared to when you buy a flat. Therefore you're getting less for your money, as in less space for your money. You might be able to afford quite a spacious 3-bed flat, but you might be only able to afford a small 2-bed house instead for the same amount of money. In terms of refurbishment potential, houses typically have more potential to refurbish than flats, because obviously with a house you could extend it, you could build another floor, you could dig down into the basement, and you can do lots of different things like that. But with a flat you can't necessarily do that. For example, if you lived on the 3rd floor in a flat, you can't exactly extend out the side. You can only adjust and redo what's already there. Because a house has the potential to make it much larger using one of those things we just talked about, or by adding a conservatory or a garage, there tends to be much more ability to forcibly increase the value of your house by doing a refurbishment that you don't necessarily get with a flat. With a flat you might also struggle with what you can and can't change. Not only will you need to get planning permission where appropriate, but you might also need to get permission from the management company or whoever owns the ground, because obviously you're only renting it, and you might also need to get permission from your neighbours. Therefore, you might really struggle trying to do a refurbishment if there's a lot of different barriers against you. The owner or the management company will probably even charge you for that permission and also say that they need to do a bunch of different checks that you'll also have to pay for. They could make it really difficult and really expensive for you to get that permission, or they might make it really easy. But again, you're running that risk with a leasehold property that you don't necessarily get with a house, because obviously there's no one there to kind of boss you around like a management company does. If you've made it this far into the video, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and check out some of my other videos if you haven't already. So far we've discovered that flats are typically cheaper than houses because they're typically smaller and closer to neighbours. But flats also rent out for less than houses as well. But interestingly, the return on investment is often better. Here's an example to prove it. A small flat in Surrey sells for about £180,000, and that could typically rent out for about £800 a month or £9,600 a year. And that's about a return on investment of 5.3%. And those figures are fairly standard for Surrey. Now, a small house, also in Surrey, it'd sell for about £250,000. That you could actually rent out for a little bit more, because obviously houses tend to sell and rent for a bit more, £1,000 a month or £12,000 a year. But interestingly, that's only about a 4.8% return on investment. And therefore, even though you're getting more money each month, because obviously the property costs quite a bit more, you're comparatively making a smaller amount on a percentage terms each month. Now obviously that's gross return on investment, not net return on investment. And therefore, even though flats might come across as worse, they might actually be a better investment because they can obviously get you a higher ROI. But obviously you do have to remember that you don't actually own the ground that the property is built on. Obviously there's a management company. And if your management company are kind of crap and don't repair the communal areas when obviously they're not looking so great, you could have a real issue. I actually almost bought a leasehold property that obviously needed a refurbishment, but it was a great deal for what everything else was selling for in that area. But it wasn't until that I saw some damage in the communal areas and I asked the neighbours about the management company. They said they hadn't been able to get hold of the management company for the past 10 months or maybe even longer to fix the small hole in the wall. So obviously that could have really impacted my investment, because if there was some damage to the roof, that might not get fixed for a year, 2 years, 3 years. You might end up living without a roof or with a giant hole in your roof because no one's coming to fix it. And in terms of what's best, obviously providing you have a good management company, I suppose it also depends on your attitude to risk. For example, if you like quite a safe, low risk investment, houses might be better because obviously you own the property and everything that goes on with it. But if you prefer taking maybe slightly more risk for more return, flats might be better. Obviously you're running the risk that you don't own the land that the property is built on, and you're obviously not the management company. But obviously if you feel like taking that risk, you might be able to earn a higher ROI. And if you want to learn more about investing in property, then continue watching some of my other videos. Alternatively, subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell. That way you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Cheers!